Hello, historians, and welcome back. We're still talking about America since 1945. Today we're going to pick up where we left off last time when we were talking about the rise of the 1960s, as kind of the traditional conception of it is anyway, the era of the counterculture, anti-war protests, all of that stuff. The 1960s was kind of this flowering of activity on the left end of the political spectrum. Today we're going to talk about how that kind of ground to a halt, maybe not ground to a halt, but how did how did the 60s end? How did that kind of era end? And what replaced it? And so we're going to be talking about the rise of the new right, which is going to be kind of the backlash and then counterpart to the rise of the new left that we just talked about last time. So to do that, I'm going to touch on a few topics here. So we're going to start with basically the 60s as we know it, kind of started to come to an end in 1968, and we'll talk about why. And then we'll talk about then we're going to spend the bulk of our time today talking about the 1970s. Because the 1970s was a really weird decade, especially compared to the decades that we've been talking about so far here, the late 40s, 50s, and even the 1960s. The 1970s was a really weird kind of a decade. And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll wrap up with some kind of concluding thoughts along the way. First, I said that 1968 is just one of those years. It's one of those important years in American history. It is important for a lot of reasons. We've actually already touched on some of these along the way, but it began with the Tet Offensive in January, when, if you remember the Vietnam discussion, that was when somewhere in the order of 50,000 or so Viet Cong rose up and attacked all these South Vietnamese cities and surprised the U.S. and surprised the world because it was all caught on tape. Well, this was the moment at which Americans started to really believe that the Vietnam conflict had gone awry, and that maybe this wasn't worth it. So the Tet Offensive became an important moment for the Vietnam War, became an important moment for the United States also, because kind of the idealism of the Vietnam War and the idealism of a lot of people in the United States kind of started to wane. And so at the very beginning, 1968 was off to a rocky start. We talked also about the My Lai massacre, about 6 weeks after the Tet Offensive, when American soldiers lined up villagers in a couple of villages in Vietnam and mowed them all down with machine guns, regardless of their affiliation with the Viet Cong. And this, as I mentioned last time, or when I talked about Vietnam, once this news became public, which was admittedly a year later, but when this news became public, a lot of Americans started to wonder, how was this war corrupting America's youth? I mean, American teenagers, American 20-somethings, they're not supposed to be bloodthirsty killers that are lining people up and mowing them down with machine guns. That's like the Nazis used to do. And so the idea that American soldiers are doing that also is really going to disillusion a lot of people, because wow, what is this war like when it is driving good American kids to do this kind of thing? And then soon after that, Martin Luther King Jr., the probably the most famous civil rights leader of all time, was assassinated in Memphis, which sparked a whole bunch of riots in cities across the country. But the death of Martin Luther King was a big moment for white and black audiences, I mean, for followers. Black people, obviously, because of his role in the civil rights movement, but even a lot of whites who kind of put a lot of faith in him as being a unifying figure in the United States. And his death brings an end to that dream. Over the rest of the year, the Democratic Party in American politics, the Democrats fell apart over the issue of Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson, who was president, decided not to run for re-election in March of '68, which opened the field up to Democratic candidates. And so there was a long primary process where the Democratic Party was largely divided between two wings: the pro-Vietnam hawk wing of the party and the anti-Vietnam Dove wing of the party. And so over on the Dove side, you've got people like Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy. Over on the hawkish column, you've got Johnson, of course, isn't in the running, but his shadow is kind of over everybody here. And then you also have Hubert Humphrey, who had been Johnson's vice president, who decided to run for president after Johnson bowed out. And so the problem that Humphrey is going to have to face, of course, is that his affiliation with the Vietnam War, because he was part of the Johnson administration. So the Democrats start to feud among themselves over the issue of Vietnam, and that just leads to a lot of turmoil for the party. That turmoil gets even worse in June when Robert Kennedy, who by June had become one of the frontrunners for the Democratic nomination, was assassinated in a hotel in Los Angeles on June 5th. His assassination wasn't, as far as we know, wasn't really political. It was just kind of a lone gunman who decided to take out his anger on the world against Robert Kennedy. And so Robert Kennedy had been, again, he had been seen as the front runner in the Democratic primary. He had also been one of the leaders of the anti-war faction in the Democratic Party. And so his death threw the party into further turmoil. And of course, this is the second high-level assassination in a 3-month period. Martin Luther King had been, was just assassinated, as I just mentioned, back in April, and suddenly Robert Kennedy is killed in June. So this is a sign that something's gone wrong, and that there's a lot of trouble afoot. We talked before about the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which turned into mayhem in August of '68. The Democratic primaries kind of came to its head here, and eventually Hubert Humphrey, the Johnson's vice president, got the nomination. But the bigger news was all of the chaos that was erupting outside. As anti-war protesters, there were the Performance Street artists that were nominating Pegasus for president that I talked about before. The Democratic convention just kind of devolved into chaos, demonstrating that, there's trouble out there. And then finally in the presidential election in November, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, walks away with an easy win. The Democrats had largely been shredded during that primary campaign, had largely been fighting amongst themselves, and so the Democratic candidate, Humphrey, came out of it very wounded. Humphrey, there was a third-party candidate, which kind of threw off some of the vote totals a little bit, was George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, who had been famous for his segregate, whatever the term is, but he was the segregation candidate, where he wanted to put a stop to all these civil rights activities that were happening in the United States because he saw that as evil. So we've got this three-way race. Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, wins, and we'll have a lot more to say about him a little bit later. Now, Nixon inherited a problem. The economy was starting to fall apart. There are a lot of reasons for it. Part of it was that really, really expensive war effort over in Vietnam. That was costing a lot of money. Part of it was a whole bunch of social programs that Lyndon Johnson had put in place during the Great Society. That had been costing a lot of money also. But there were also other trends happening around the world, which we're going to talk about as we go here. But just to give you a sense of what is happening, we start to see in the late 60s and into the early 1970s, we start to see unemployment on the rise, doubling, almost tripling in that 6-year period. The gross national product is starting to fall over time. We don't need to get into details about what all of these terms mean. I just want you to kind of see the trend here. Unemployment percentages are going up. Gross national product, which is basically the output of the United States, is falling. Inflation rates are going up, which means that whenever you've got inflation, you've got the value of the dollar is falling, and so it costs more money to buy the same thing that was cheaper before. So rent's going up over time, for example. The price of food going up over time. And the problem is that if you, as the consumer, are not getting higher income, then it's going to be more and more difficult to pay for that stuff. And so that's the concept of inflation. But then we also saw this weird development in the 1970s called what that economists had never seen before, where they called stagflation. which is this when inflation is going up, but demand is also falling. Um, so we've got what happens is normally in a normal economy, if you've got unemployment going up, that means less people have less money to spend, which generally means prices go down because demand is going down because people don't have as much money to buy stuff with. However, there was this weird circumstance in the 1970s where prices continued to go up, even though people's spending power went down. And that's not supposed to happen, but it did happen. And so economists had to make up this new term called stagflation. And for a while, there was even kind of this running, I don't even know if it's a joke or what it was, but newspapers tended to publish what they called the misery index, which was where you add the rate of inflation plus the rate of unemployment, and that becomes the country's misery index. And that's, I mean, the idea that we have something called a misery index and that people are tracking it over time kind of indicates that there's some serious problems going on with the American economy at that point. The average weekly wages of Americans start to collapse in the 1970s. There had been a very long rise in weekly wages for Americans, largely due to unionization efforts and due to corporations being a bit more liberal with their benefits and with raises and all of that because the economy was booming in post-war America in the 1950s and 60s. However, in the 1970s, that starts to level off and then it starts to drop back down again. Partly because of the declining power of unions, part of it because corporations are being less generous in their pay, and then part of it is also just because corporations' profits start to fall in the 1970s, 1980s, and onwards. We start to see this process called deindustrialization in the United States starting in the 1970s. And what that means is that the industry that had kept the American economy afloat throughout the post-war period, the 1940s, 1950s, 60s, that industrial economy was starting to decline. And there's a lot of different reasons for it. But a big one is that one of the reasons the American economy had boomed so much in the 1950s and 60s was that the rest of the world had been leveled during World War II. Not all of it, but most of the industrial powers of the world had been leveled. The East, Western Europe had been leveled. Japan had been leveled. Remember those atomic bombs. The Soviet Union big chunks of it had been leveled. And so it took them a long time to rebuild their industrial infrastructure. But they did. And by the 1970s, those other countries had rebuilt, and they had also rebuilt with shiny new cutting-edge state-of-the-art factories. In many cases, the United States was still using the old polluting factories from the 1890s. And so when those other factories came online around the world, they were much more productive, much more efficient than the factories in the United States were. And so those other countries were able to start offering manufactured goods for lower prices because their production costs were lower. And so American manufacturers started to go into a very long decline. And this became known as the concept of deindustrialization, where the United States is moving away from a manufacturing economy to something else, a service economy, a tech economy. We'll see that kind of play out over the rest of, over future discussions here. But the country is starting to lose its manufacturing. And that, of course, is going to throw a lot of workers off into the unemployment lines. That's fueling a lot of that unemployment that we just talked about a few minutes ago, is that factories are shutting down, and a lot of workers who grew up working in factories, and their parents worked in factories, and probably their grandparents worked in factories, a lot of those people are now no longer going to have opportunities in factories. And so there's going to be this turmoil in the 1970s and onward as the United States tries to figure out how do we transition manufacturing workers into other sectors of the economy, and also just what does the mean of declining in manufacturing mean for the country in general. That's going to be a long-running discussion in the United States. The Over time, though, American manufacturing is going to catch up in some ways to the rest of the world by building much more efficient factories. And so over time, the actual manufacturing output, meaning the number of things that are produced by manufacturing in the United States, that is actually going to continue to either stay level or even increase over time. It's just the number of workers necessary in those factories is going to collapse. So that's kind of the world we live in today, where we still have there are a lot of factories operating in the United States. It's just most of them are being, they have robots putting things together rather than people putting things together. And so we're still in this kind of post-industrial economy in the United States, but we can trace that back to the 1970s. Another thing that's fueling inflation is what was the oil crisis of the early 1970s, when the OPEC, the oil-producing nations of the world, largely based in the Middle East, but also some in South America, cut off the supply of oil to the United States and other Western European countries because of support for Israel. There's a lot of kind of politics of the Middle East that we don't need to get into here, but the U.S. was targeted by these oil producing countries, and the supply of oil was reduced. And that means that the price of, as the supply of oil goes down, the demand for oil stays the same, so prices are going to skyrocket. And the rising cost of oil then trickles down to other areas of the economy because, truckers then have to charge more to move goods because of the oil prices. Stores then have to raise their prices on goods that were brought to them on those trucks because the truckers are charging more. So the stores have to charge more to the customer. And so inflation goes up and up and up and up, at the same time that employment is going down and down and down. So that's where the whole stagflation concept comes in. And so the oil crisis had some dramatic effects on the U.S. There were lines of people, the states and cities would pass rules where you could only get gas on certain days to try to limit the number of people that are getting gas at one time. A lot of places lowered their speed limits from the old 70 to 55 to try to conserve gas because cars are more efficient, use gas more efficiently, kind of in that middle range speed. And so there were lots of little changes to American life, but the overall sense of this crisis, there was a lot of sense to this crisis, and we'll get to that in just a minute here, but the oil crisis is helping to fuel that inflation. I'll kind of just end it on that right now. Which leads to examples of other problems. Gas dealers beware. You kind of have this. If you look at the kind of the dystopian sci-fi movies and books of the last century, a lot of those are kind of built on the idea that there was some sort of resource scarcity, and that mentality kind of became real in some places in the U.S. There were a lot of people who believed that, the end times are upon us. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But I just want to give you a sense of that things are really starting to fall apart. And it just seems to get worse over time. One historian is called the 1970s, kind of the long 70s, from like 68 through the early 80s. This decade of nightmares, which in some ways feels right, because this was the era in which it really felt like the United States was falling apart, especially to the people that were living in the U.S. at the time. And starting off in 1969 with the Manson family murders out in California, the idea that this guy, Charles Manson, was able to convince or brainwash a group of, teenagers and young 20-somethings to follow his orders to go out and murder people. Well, that's upsetting, because wow, what does this mean for our kids, that they can be convinced by some whack job to go out and kill people on his orders? And this is coming in around the same time as news about the My Lai massacre. And so, wow, something might be wrong with the American youth here. If overseas they're lining people up and mowing them down with machine guns, and then also here at home, they're murdering people in their sleep after breaking into their homes. there's something wrong there. And so there's this fear in the 1970s about, long-running fears about juvenile delinquency and rising crime and all of that. But there's also just a sense that that something is going wrong with American youth in this country. There's also something going wrong at the highest levels of power in the United States when the president of the United States is ordering a goon squad to break into private businesses, meaning the psychiatrist for Daniel Ellsberg, the guy that leaked the Pentagon Papers, or ordering them to break into the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate building. The idea that this guy is ordering people that the president is ordering people to go break the law in pursuit of his political dreams is upsetting. And so Watergate represented this dramatic moment in American history when a lot of people started to lose faith in their national government because there had always been this sense that the Constitution would prevent people like Nixon from coming into office. But Nixon was so paranoid and politically corrupt that when those facts came to light, over things like the Watergate and the Ellsberg break-in and other stories that came out about how he was using his squad of people to go harass people, that when those stories all broke, a lot of Americans started to really lose their faith in the Constitution, in our system of government, because how could our system let someone like Nixon come into office? And so Watergate was a hugely traumatic moment for the United States. As we know, Nixon was impeached, which meant that the House of Representatives drew up charges against him, impeachment charges, which were based on newspaper investigations and their own investigations. The break-in was actually a pretty clumsy operation. The guys that broke into the building got caught because a security guard saw them with like flashlights and stuff, so they all got arrested. And it pretty quickly came out that these guys were getting paid by this Republican Party slush fund that was being controlled by the Nixon campaign. And so the story came out over time, and it became a very convoluted and very crazy story. And so Nixon, the House of Representatives did draw up impeachment charges against him. The impeachment trial never happened because he decided to resign rather than face trial. So he wasn't actually removed from office, but impeachment is not the removal of the president. The impeachment is the investigation and the trial of the president. And so anyway, he avoided all that by resigning in August of 1974. His successor, Gerald Ford, who had been his vice president, the trivia moment that I'm pretty much obliged to mention here is that Gerald Ford became the only president in American history who was never elected president, nor was he elected vice president, because Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had had to resign from office a few months earlier for corruption charges. So the entire Nixon administration was kind of tarnished with this corruption. Anyway, so Nixon leaves office, Gerald Ford takes over, and then Gerald Ford pardons Nixon of all crimes. Claiming that he wanted to end the long national nightmare. As he put it, the long national nightmare is over. He wanted the United States to just to move forward, stop dwelling on the evils of the past, and move on to a glorious new future. Which, okay, in a way that makes sense, but all that really did was further disillusion Americans, because a lot of people had been kind of holding on to the idea that, you know what, Nixon, okay, he didn't get impeached, he didn't get removed from office, but maybe once he's out of office, he'll get prosecuted, maybe he'll get some jail time. And of course, none of that happened. And so this further disillusioned Americans and soured them on the ability of the United States Constitution to deal with crisis and to deal with bad actors like Richard Nixon. So the Ford pardoning was another traumatic moment in all of that. And again, I mentioned the oil crisis. Before I was talking about how it affected the economy, and now I want to talk about how it kind of affected the American psyche. What this did was this told the United States that there are small countries around the world in the Middle East and South America who can exert power over the United States. That's traumatic. The United States had always thought of itself as the one exerting power. We are the one, we Americans like to think of ourselves as being the ones in power and in the driver's seat. And so the idea that other countries around the world could almost bring us to our knees by cutting off the oil supply, that was a very traumatic realization for a lot of Americans. We do not have control over our own destiny the way we like to think we did. So, we like to think that, the rest of the world would kowtow to us and would supply whatever we need. We would take it if we can't get it. The OPEC oil embargo, as it was called, the oil crisis as it kind of manifested in the United States, demonstrated that we, the United States, do not have power over the rest of the world like we thought we did. And that's difficult for a lot of people to kind of understand. Patty Hearst, the Symbionese Liberation Army. This is another kind of weird moment in the 1970s when there was this group, the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was basically a group of bank robbers, but they liked to kind of play themselves up as, freedom fighters, and, they're fighting for a cause and all of that. They kidnapped Patty Hearst, who was the heir to the Hearst newspaper fortune, millions of her family is worth millions of dollars. They kidnapped her, and instead of rebelling against them, she ended up joining them. There's the old Stockholm syndrome, as people call it, and so she ended up going with them to go help to rob banks and all of that. Eventually, the group ended up killing a woman at a bank in California, and the full weight of the law fell on them. And Patty Hearst was they were all eventually arrested. A lot of them actually died in shootouts, but she was arrested. She refused to forsake her people in the SLA. And so anyway, we don't need to get into too much detail there. But again, the idea that a millionaire's daughter could be brainwashed and to help bank robbers kill people, it's, again, another sign that there's something wrong with this culture, something wrong with this society, that even a millionaire's daughter could be swept up in it. Even if you want to think that, the people fighting over in Vietnam and mowing people down with machine guns, well, though, maybe some people can think, they're poor, they're uneducated, they don't know better. A millionaire's daughter, you really can't make the same argument about. And so this further disillusioned a lot of Americans. And then there was the ending to the Vietnam War, which ended in outright disaster for the South Vietnamese. Of course, South Vietnam ceased to exist once the North successfully invaded. But again, for the United States, this was, the U.S. had withdrawn from Vietnam back in 1973, but when South Vietnam fell to the North in 1975, that was, in some ways kind of a dagger in the back for Americans who had lost relatives and had lost their sons, brothers in that Vietnam conflict before 1973. The idea that the North was able to conquer the South and the Americans fled was just, disheartening. It was, maybe angering for a lot of Americans because, wow, why did we go through all that effort if we just lose the whole thing after 2 years? And so the fall of South Vietnam contributing to disillusionment and all of that. Then the Jonestown massacre, which, again, we don't need to go into too much detail here, but this is the origin of the old drinking the Kool-Aid meme that everyone always talks about. Jim Jones was a charismatic preacher. He wasn't really even a preacher. I don't know really didn't even know how to describe him. He was a charismatic speaker who convinced hundreds of Americans to join his cult. And when they joined his cult, they would, sign over Social Security checks to him and all that. So he lived very high on the hog while everybody else was serving in his cult. He was harassed, of course, by American law enforcement agencies, so they fled to South America, to Guyana. Congress continued to investigate. The FBI continued to investigate because these are still American citizens that are being affected by this guy. And eventually, when the wall started closing in on him, he and his security force forced all of his followers to drink poisoned. It actually wasn't Kool-Aid. It was another knockoff called Flavor Aid. Not that that matters, but historical accuracy. To drink this Flavor Aid that was laced with poison, and hundreds of people died in this. And those those in the back of the crowd that saw the ones in the front of the crowd start dying when those ones tried to get away, his security force was surrounding them all with machine guns, and they shot down anybody that tried to escape. And so again, the idea that hundreds of Americans could be persuaded by this guy to pick up their lives, abandon their families, and move to South America, sign over all their money to this guy. Another sign something's wrong. That's kind of the recurring theme here, and that's why I'm talking about this decade of nightmares. Maybe nightmares is too strong a word, but there's this ongoing problem here. And then abroad, more crises developing around the world, which are demonstrating the limits of American influence and American power. In 1978, that revolution broke out in Iran. You may remember from a couple lectures ago, we were talking about the American overthrow of the democratically elected prime minister of Iran back in 1953, Mohammad Mossadegh. The guy we put in place was the kind of corrupt. The Shah of Iran was his family had been in charge of Iran for a long time. His family, collaborated with Western powers to get oil out of Iran. And so when that guy was put back into power by the United States, that created a whole lot of resentment against the U.S. And so in 78, there was a revolution against the Shah and his family. And in the middle of all of that, a bunch of American diplomats and American employees in the American embassy there in Tehran got taken hostage. And this hostage, and they were held hostage for a very long time. They were held hostage for more than a year. And there were attempts to rescue them. There was one big military attempt to rescue them where the U.S. Sent a bunch of helicopters towards the suspected hideout for where the hostages were. But there was a dust storm, and one of the helicopters broke down. Another helicopter got got damaged in the dust storm, and so the whole mission had to be called off. And so this was a huge black eye for the United States because we got Americans being held hostage, and the Americans can't seem to get them out. The Iranians weren't responding to negotiations. The U.S. tried a military attack, and that failed miserably. And so the American military can't seem to get its act together. The military is falling apart. This coming on the heels of Vietnam, and how I talked in the Vietnam lecture about how the American military started to fall apart there in Vietnam. This is kind of another indication that the American military is in a shambles, and that we cannot seem to exert power. So the hostage crisis in Iran made the U.S. look impotent, made it look like it could not project power around the world, made it look like we were being hemmed in, which gave, which sparked whole other crises. There was another oil crisis in 79 when the oil-producing countries again shut off the supply of oil to the United States, causing a lot of the same turmoil that I just talked about, rising prices, but also a sense that the U.S. is beholden to other countries around the world, other small countries that the U.S. would not think as rivals or would not think of as potential, people in control, whatever you want to call that. All right, and then we talked before about the environmental crisis, 3 Mile Island, because, the idea had been, okay, let's try to maybe if we can move on to other sources of energy instead of oil, because oil seems to be a problem. Let's start focusing on other types of energy. And so nuclear energy was seen as kind of a clean alternative to oil and other, hydrocarbon-based energy supplies. And also, nuclear is homegrown, so we would not be beholden to foreign countries over our supply of nuclear power. And that was great until there was that near meltdown at 3 Mile Island in 1979, which demonstrated that there are some serious economic, environmental, and health concerns related to nuclear power. And so 3 Mile Island, that that near disaster. It was, I mean, there was still some damage, but it could have been much, much worse. But it really was kind of a nail in the slowly building coffin for nuclear power in the United States. And then late in 1979, that same year, is the hostage crisis and the 3 Mile Island and the oil crisis. In December of 79, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan on its southwestern border. The Soviets were looking to expand their influence in southwestern Asia, and the U.S., you know, this was a containment breach, that the Soviet Union is expanding out into another area. I mean, Afghanistan turned into a bit of a fiasco for the Soviets, which we'll talk more about later, because in Afghanistan has been a lot of people, a lot of countries have tried to invade Afghanistan over the years, and a lot of them have suffered badly. It doesn't go well for anybody. The British, the Soviets, even the U.S. had some problems with Afghanistan. So it's not going to go real well for them, but this certainly demonstrated there's a problem. And the United States is no longer the world power. This is, in some ways, the Soviet Union's kind of thumbing their nose at the United States because of a sense that the U.S. can't do anything. And so, again, for another blow to the American psyche that the Soviets are on the march. At the same time, that the Americans can't seem to get helicopters into Tehran to rescue hostages. So this is demoralizing for a lot of Americans. Now, the president, Jimmy Carter, recognized that, there was a problem here, that the U.S. was encountering a lot of setbacks, a lot of obstacles. And so in July of 79, he decided to go on the air to give a speech to try to reassure Americans that, not all is lost. We're still doing pretty well. The way he phrased it, the United States was going through a crisis of confidence. The U.S. had kind of lost its step, sure, but a lot of it is also psychological in his mind. And so if we can get back into a more positive mindset, then everything will be fine. Then we will get back into kind of the position of power that we enjoyed before all these crises started to happen in the 1970s. And so Americans were expecting him to give some sort of a large response to all these problems. Like, we're going to, I don't know, go kick ass in the Middle East, or what are we going to do against the Soviets? What are we going to do to solve these problems? What big ideas do you have, Mr. President? And his ideas that he talked about in this speech did not live up to the hype or the hope of a lot of Americans. And so he talked about things like, okay, oil is expensive, which means heating oil for homes are expensive, so we should just wear more sweaters. We should turn down the thermostat a bit. These are in some ways, these are very practical suggestions for things like high oil prices and all of that. But when Americans are looking for strong leadership with big ideas, that fell very short. And so a lot of Americans kind of mocked this whole crisis of confidence speech because Carter had no big ideas. He didn't have any grand way to solve the decline of American influence and power around the world. And so this turned out to be pretty much a dud. So Carter's attempt to resolve this crisis of confidence turned into kind of a fiasco. And this was, in some ways I feel bad for Carter. He was not the decisive leader that the U.S. needed at the time. There was also a month or so before that speech, there had been this weird incident, which, means nothing in the overall scheme of American history. But when we're talking about Jimmy Carter, it's just kind of something that is just kind of amusing. So Carter was fishing one day at Camp David. Camp David is a presidential retreat that presidents have been going to for a long, long time. And in Camp David, there was a pond and this creek here. And so Carter was out fishing one day by himself. And while he was fishing, a rabbit walked up to the shoreline and started screeching at him. And now this is very weird behavior for a rabbit. Rabbits are usually pretty timid. They tend to run away. But in this case, this rabbit just started screeching at Carter. And so Carter kind of laughed and thought that was kind of amusing. And then the bunny jumps in the water and starts swimming towards Carter. And Carter's, this is getting even weirder. And so Carter eventually takes the paddle and kind of starts smacking the surface of the water. And this bunny, which is still screeching, swimming towards him, eventually veers off and swims away. And that would have been the end of it. Carter would have, he might have told the story to his buddies when he got back, to the living quarters or whatever. But the problem for Carter is that this whole thing was caught on film by a photographer, and so these images. I mean, this is the image here. This is the bunny swimming away. This is the this is the original shot. This is the blown up shot, and then this is Carter trying to bat the bunny away with the oar. Now, again, this could have just been a kind of a funny little thing, but newspaper editors thought this was amazingly funny. And so across the country, you start to see stories popping up about Carter fighting off a killer rabbit with paddle on fishing trip. Now, all of these things were done in, tongue-in-cheek. They were all meant to be, this was kind of an amusing thing, but it was showing up in newspapers all over the place. And so the joke kind of became, wow, you know what? This country has gotten to the point where the Secret Service cannot protect the president from a rabbit. This does not bode well for the United States. And this became kind of a punchline. And this is the kind of the environment that was in play when Carter tried to give that crisis of confidence speech. So people were already kind of cued to not take Carter very seriously. I don't want to blame the killer rabbit for the failure of the crisis of confidence speech. There was a lot wrong with that speech. It was lacking big ideas, but it's just a sign that there's something weird going on in the United States. Now, it's not all bad. Carter was right. It wasn't all bad. The U.S. did some really amazing things in the late 60s and early 70s. We went to the moon for a bunch of missions, for 17 missions in the Apollo project. Put up the world's first long-term space station, Skylab, which eventually disintegrated over Australia, but that's a story for another day. But we built the first space station. We built the World Trade Center, which at the time, those were the tallest buildings in the world. Obviously, we'll talk more about the World Trade Center later, but at the time, this was an architectural marvel, and that the U.S. and of course it was built in the U.S. So that's great. In 1971, a new constitutional amendment lowering the voting age to 18 because the idea that if 18-year-olds are going to get drafted to go fight overseas in places like Vietnam, they should be able to vote on the people who are going to send them overseas. And so there was a new constitutional amendment that lowered the voting age to 18. Good. There was also, this is the era in which the modern computer was born. This is the Altair 8800, the world's first mini computer kit, as Popular Electronics said in 1975. This was not a computer that any of us would recognize today. It basically had a bunch of buttons and levers, and you could use the buttons and levers to program specific things to happen. Very rudimentary compared to today, and amazingly expensive. If you can take the save over $1,000, if that's the discount, then you can imagine what the original price was. But this is the kind of the dawn of the modern personal computer age. You've even got scientific calculators down there at the bottom left. The first video game, Pong, in 1972, which was, again, very rudimentary compared to today, but, launched an entire industry based on video games, launched a whole bunch of childhoods in the 1980s, even my own. Didn't play Pong all that much, but I played a whole lot of other, systems after that, Atari, Nintendo, Sony, PlayStation, and all that. So Pong was the forerunner of a very lucrative industry and billions of dollars worth today. It was the birth of disco. Moving on. We had the really good Star Wars movies happening at that time. We had the not so good Battlestar Galactica episodes. I suppose that joke's probably going to get older now that Battlestar Galactica's off the air. But anyway, whatever. This was also the era in which Elvis and Nixon got together to fight the war on drugs. Elvis, who was very well known for taking drugs, had offered his services to the Nixon administration to help go undercover to find drug dealers. The joke, of course, was that Elvis was looking for drugs to use. Nixon didn't take him up on the offer, but he did give him a nice plastic DEA badge, which Elvis got kind of a kick out of. So anyway, it's not everything. There wasn't all bad stuff happening, but there was a lot of bad stuff happening. And so this is going to affect American politics in the long term. I talked last time about how all that activity, the environmental movement, anti-nuclear movement, student movements, the civil rights movement, all of that stuff had kind of exploded all the political activity out on the left end of the political spectrum. That's going to spark a backlash and a response, of course, on the right end of the political spectrum. And so, as the 1970s goes on, we're going to see the rise of a new political movement on the right end of the political spectrum. Not all the way to fascism, just like on the left, it's not all the way to communism, but it is kind of rebuilding the old political spectrum that had existed before the Cold War, had truncated it. So what's happening on the right? There's a lot of activity because there's a lot of stuff going on that a lot of people don't like in the United States. I've been talking about it this whole time, all that stuff about oil crises and the lack of American military power and a lack of American respect for the United States, respect for American government. There's a lot of nasty stuff happening, and we're starting to see a lot of mobilization on the right end of the political spectrum for how to fix those problems. But the things that they're responding to, and they're responding to the chaos in the streets, like the anti-war movement. Thousands and thousands, and in some cases millions of Americans mobilizing in opposition to the American military and in opposition to official government policies was upsetting to a lot of people. Urban rebellions. I haven't talked a whole lot about these yet, but there have been riots breaking out in cities across the country. A lot of these were race-driven. And so, that was part of our civil rights discussions a couple weeks ago. But there were these riots and uprisings happening in cities across the country. This is Watts in California in 1965. The aftermath of Watts. The Newark, New Jersey in July of 67. We've got, and in many of these cases, we have National Guard troops going into the cities to try to put a stop to these riots. And so we've got what looks like armies of, white guys with machine guns walking through black neighborhoods the goal was to put down these riots, but the imagery always makes it come across that you've got, heavily armed white people versus unarmed black people. And so a lot of the imagery that comes out of these riots are going to fuel a lot of the kind of the racial tension that's existing at the time. So, but the idea that these cities are being destroyed from within by by black residents who are upset with the status quo is upsetting to a lot of people outside of the cities because, wow, this is just, pointless destruction. So this one's happening in Detroit. Then we've, more of Detroit here. And again, the National Guard is being sent into Detroit to try to put an end to it. And this is just furthering that dynamic that I was just talking about here. Washington, D.C. in 1968 was affected by it. So people in the same city as Congress having the same problem here. Detroit in 68. Baltimore in 68. So we see the same thing happening in different cities across the country. And so this is a demonstration that this is a pervasive problem and it needs to be fixed. Even Kansas City, places you don't expect, are encountering a lot of the same violence, and for a lot of the same reasons. All right, then there's also other movements happening that are kind of upsetting to a lot of kind of traditionally minded Americans. Native Americans who hadn't been heard from in a long time kind of embrace the Black Power movement if for their own purposes. They create the Red Power movement, where they start to try to make their grievances known through not always violence, but through protests of a variety of ways. The one of the most famous protests that Native Americans pursued in the 1970s was the occupation of Alcatraz Island, which Alcatraz was a prison island off the coast of San Francisco. And American Indians occupied that island for a year or so, trying to draw attention to the cause of poor treatment of Native Americans, poor treatment on the reservations, poor conditions on the reservations. But it's, again, this is just one more kind of group of people protesting against the status quo. And so the new right is going to be a response to all of these little things that are happening. Chaos in the universities, and we've got all these students kind of occupying administration buildings and giving speeches that are blasting the United States and attacking it, and sometimes even praising the Soviet Union, sometimes attacking American soldiers verbally. So the idea that all these college students are rebelling is upsetting to a lot of traditionally minded Americans because, again, these colleges are paid for by taxes. And back in the 1960s, 1970s, many of you will probably cry to hear this, but college was free to most state residents. If you were, you'd pay for books. But tuition, there was no tuition for a lot of these, in a lot of universities back then. And so the idea that, students who are being given a free ride at these universities are using that opportunity to blast the system that allows them to go to college was upsetting to a lot of people. And then there was attacks, in in all that left-wing agitation, whatever you want to call it, there were also a lot of attacks on the traditional family unit. Feminism, which is the idea that women should get out of the house. They shouldn't be, they don't have to be stay-at-home moms. They can go find fulfillment elsewhere. This was an attack on the traditional family unit. The idea that women and mothers would leave the family either to go to work or maybe not raise a family in the first place, that was upsetting to a lot of people. The Equal Rights Amendment, which would have been an amendment to the Constitution to codify the equality of the sexes. This text here is the entire text of the Equal Rights Amendment. Equality of rights shall not be, under the law, shall not be abridged by the United States by any state on account of sex. The Equal Rights Amendment was seen as kind of the legal version of feminism, and this upset a lot of traditionally minded people also. Phyllis Schlafly became kind of the leading spokesperson against the Equal Rights Amendment because she made the argument that this would upset the traditional family dynamic. Traditional family values would crumble if women had equality with men. Now, in her mind, women have equality in that they are respected within the household. Feminists tend to think that, well, okay, that's fine, but they need to be respected outside of the household also. Phyllis Schlafly and her followers argued that no, the old way was the better way of doing it, and they were able to successfully block the enactment of the Equal Rights Amendment once it was sent out to the states for ratification. Under the argument of don't monkey with the Constitution. Equal rights, yes. The amendment, no. And so we start to see kind of this rebellion against feminism within traditionally minded Americans. But then it starts to take on a whole new meaning when the attacks on the family unit come through things like birth control. And then later, of course, abortion. Those things are going to be, very dramatic attacks on the traditional family unit. From the feminist perspective, the issue here is that women want to be able to have some control over their own lives, control over their own bodies, control over their own reproductive abilities. Whereas from the traditional perspective, that's going to lead to fewer children. That's going to lead to a dramatic change in the family structure. And a lot of traditionally minded Americans believe that the family structure had been one of the sources of American greatness for centuries at this point. And so the idea that, birth control and abortion are going to change the dynamic between men and women, between mothers and fathers, and between parents and their kids, that was tremendously upsetting to a lot of people. And of course, the abortion issue, of course, is still alive and well today. We're hearing about it all the time in the news lately. It's become kind of this cultural divide among Americans over supporters of abortion and opponents of abortion. The gay liberation movement was another attack on the traditional family unit because, if men start having relationships with other men and women start having relationships with other women, that's going to disrupt the traditional family structure. And so the gay liberation movement, which has largely been credited with getting it started, the Stonewall um, and riots at the near the Stonewall Inn in New York City in the wake of a bunch of police raids. The gay liberation movement, which eventually started to include gay pride parades, and eventually, when you get into the 21st century, things like gay marriage and all of that, it's a movement that is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's also going to alienate more and more people. And so there's going to be, again, the traditionally minded folks are not going to appreciate this change in the family dynamic. And there's just a new generation of what they at the time were called muckrakers. You probably heard the term muckrakers from the progressive era when there were journalists and writers who were exposing um, bad business practices. They were exposing political corruption back during the progressive era. There was another generation of writers that were doing that in the 1970s, 1960s and 1970s. We talked before about Rachel Carson writing her book about DDT and pesticides. Ralph Nader became famous writing this book, Unsafe at Any Speed, where he exposed the design flaws of American-made automobiles, and a lot of times he discovered that those design flaws were known, and they were intentional in some cases, as a way to cut production costs for those cars. And so Nader exposed that, which brought a whole lot of controversy to the automobile industry. The Jim Bouton's Ball 4 book, I don't know, I think it fits into the same category, maybe others wouldn't, but in Ball 4, this Jim Bouton is writing about his time. He was a player in Major League Baseball for one season, and this book became his memoir of that season, what he encountered. And what he encountered was things like famous baseball players using performance-enhancing drugs, carousing with women, cheating on their wives. He basically exposed a lot of stuff that was happening in Major League Baseball that Major League Baseball did not want known. At the time in the 1970s, I mean, baseball was America's pastime, and the big names in baseball were the big names in American culture. And so the idea that these guys are getting exposed and all their dirty laundry is being aired for the world to see, that's upsetting to a lot of people. And so there's this new generation of people that are kind of exposing the bad stuff, so to speak. And then there's also all these legal attacks on traditional values happening. Brown versus Board of Education. It's yes, we hold it up as this great civil rights case, but at the same time, you got to remember that for a lot of white Americans, that was tremendously upsetting at the time because it upset the traditional racial values of the United States. The United States had always been, for people at least in their entire lifetimes, the United States had been segregated. That had seemed like the normal way of life. That had seemed like the correct way of life for a lot of white Americans, especially. And so when all that gets tossed aside in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, that's traumatic to a lot of people. All of these are Supreme Court cases here. I'll just go through them all very briefly. But we know what Brown versus Board is. Engel versus Vitale was the court case that outlawed school prayer and upset a lot of Americans because it kind of further separated church and state and removing religion from the public education. Griswold versus Connecticut was a Supreme Court decision where the birth control, where I'm trying to phrase this right, pharmacists were required to allow women to buy birth control. There had been a move, the birth control pill had come on the market in the early 1960s, and so a lot of women had tried to take advantage of it. There had been a lot of pharmacists who did not like this whole concept of birth control and had refused to allow women to they had refused to fill those prescriptions. And so Griswold versus Connecticut was a court decision which said no, if a doctor prescribes medicine like birth control pills, pharmacists do not have the right to just refuse to fill those prescriptions. So it was a victory for the birth control movement. Miranda versus Arizona. These are the famous Miranda rights that you hear on every cop show in the world, where whenever somebody gets arrested, they say that you have the right to remain silent. All of that stuff was a result of the Miranda case, because what had happened was it turns out there are a lot of people in the world, or in the United States, who do not actually know what their constitutional rights are. Shouldn't be surprising, but that's the truth. And so what would happen is that cops would tend to bully Americans into incriminating themselves in violation of the Fifth Amendment. And so the Supreme Court in 1966 ruled that the police have to remind people who are being arrested of what their rights actually are. That was upsetting to a lot of Americans who believe that now we're coddling criminals. Criminals are people tend to think that only criminals are the ones that get harassed by police officers, and so therefore we're just coddling them, we're giving them a way out, we're being too soft on crime if this Miranda decision goes into effect. And then, of course, the big one, Roe versus Wade. I'm pretty sure everyone listening to this has probably heard of this one. This is the famous case that allowed women to get abortions and has caused all kinds of controversy in the decades ever since. So there's all these legal attacks and Supreme Court decisions that are attacking traditional values. And so what all of this means, Spiro Agnew, who, as I mentioned before, was Nixon's first vice president, who eventually had to resign because of corruption, he gave this speech in 1969 where he kind of previewed a lot of the responses to all these changes that are happening. When he says it's time for America's silent majority to stand up for its rights, and let us remember the American majority includes every minority. America's secret majority is bewildered by irrational protest. And so there was this idea that Agnew and others kind of grabbed onto, that there was a silent majority of Americans who actually opposed all of these changes that were happening in the United States. And that largely became true. There was a large number of Americans who were upset by all of those changes. Wouldn't go so far as to call it a majority, but it was a sizable chunk of people in the United States. And in response to all of this stuff that's happening, all of the attacks on family values, the collapsing industrial base, the oil crises, the loss of American prestige abroad, this kind of fueled a new political movement in the 70s and into the 1980s, which has become known by political scientists and historians as the New Right, which was in response to the New Left. Now, this is, again, kind of like the New Left. This is going to be a lot of different people pursuing a lot of different goals. So there's not really one unifying umbrella organization that we can say was in charge of all of this. But a lot of these groups were kind of fellow travelers. A lot of them found receptive politicians in the Republican Party, and so the political wing of the New Right is going to become the Republican Party in the 1980s and onward. But this new conservative movement is concerned with trying to fix all these problems that I've just spent the last hour talking about. They want to restore law and order. They want to stop all those rioting in the streets. They want to stop all the destruction, the anti-war protests. And the war is over at this point, but they want to stop the protests in the street. They want to shrink the size of government. They believe, all those social programs that Lyndon Johnson put in place in the Great Society, that was expensive, and so we want to save costs by canceling a lot of those programs. If we can save costs, then we can lower taxes. We want to restore the traditional morality, traditional family units, traditional relationships between men and women, traditional relationships between parents and children. We want to restore all of that traditional morality that was seemingly frittered away in the 1960s, 1970s. We want to rebuild the American military. Make it so that, a dust storm doesn't thwart us from freeing hostages in Iran. They want to recreate a military that would be feared by the world, not mocked by the world, like it was in the wake of Vietnam. Stand up to communism and the Soviet Union. The Soviets are on the move, and we need to put a stop to that. That's part of rebuilding the military, but we need to do that. And so there was this new political movement that was building through the 1970s. And in 1980, their moment will come with the election of Ronald Reagan as president. Just before the election in 1980, Reagan had said that we are going to get government off our backs, out of our pockets, and up to the standards of decency and excellence envisioned by the founding fathers. I mean, that sentence pretty much sums up everything the conservative movement wants, because the conservative movement wants to solve and stop all of those problems that we've been talking about so far. And so when we come back next time, we'll talk about how Reagan is going to tackle those problems and how successful they're going to be. So for now, take care, and I will talk to you again soon.